Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling two of the most influential thinkers in Western philosophy.
That's right, Kant and Hegel.
And before you hit that skip button thinking, ugh, philosophy, that's got nothing to do with international relations.
Trust me on this one, folks, especially if you're prepping for the UPSC exam with IR as your optional.
This is for you.
Seriously, their ideas are the bedrock of so many key IR concepts you'll be wrestling with.
We're talking about the evolution of international systems, the role of conflict, the very nature of the
I think
state,
I'm going deep.
deep dive style.
All right, so to set the stage, we're in late 18th, early 19th century Germany.
A period of incredible intellectual ferment right on the heels of the Enlightenment and smack dab in the middle of the fallout from the French Revolution.
These guys, Kant and Hegel, they were living through some seriously world-changing events, and they were trying to make sense of it all.
It's fascinating how they both grappled with the same upheavals, but arrived at such different conclusions.
Totally different worldviews. Different lenses for understanding history, progress, the whole shebang.
And that's exactly what makes them so relevant for IR.
Because those different lenses, those contrasting ideas, they're still shaping debates today.
So let's start with Kant, Mr. Reason himself.
Champion of pure reason.
Right. He believed that there are universal moral principles, these like hardwired rules for right and wrong.
Not just for individuals.
But for states, too.
Exactly. They apply across borders, cultures, time periods, the whole enchilada.
And that leads us to one of his most famous ideas.
And let's be honest, one of the trickiest to wrap your head around.
What is it? The categorical imperative.
You gotta, basically it's like a test, a moral litmus test.
Okay, how does that work?
So before you do something, you gotta ask yourself, would it be okay if everyone, everywhere, always acted this way?
That's a good question to ask yourself, actually.
Right. If the
Okay.
answer is no, then it's probably not morally justifiable.
So you start applying that to international relations, to how states interact with each other.
Decisions about war, peace, trade, intervention.
The stakes get pretty high.
No kidding.
Now, Kant, being the optimist, that he was believed that everyone, individuals and states, acted according to these universal moral principles.
Then we could create a genuinely more peaceful world.
He really thought we could reason our way to peace, huh?
He did. He envisioned this world order based on republic's cooperation rule of law.
Sounds pretty utopian.
It does. But Kant wasn't naive.
Oh, I'm sure he knew humans can be a messy bunch.
He absolutely did. In fact, he recognized that we have this tension within us.
Between what?
Between our desire to be social, to cooperate.
And our selfish instincts.
Right, our drive for individual gain, what he called unsocial sociability.
Unsocial, that's brilliant.
It's such a perfect way to describe that inner struggle we all experience, right?
For sure.
And for Kant, that struggle wasn't a bad thing. It was actually the engine of progress.
Okay, so we've got Kant, champion of reason, believer in universal morality, and a cautious optimist.
Cautious optimist. I like that.
Now let's turn to Hegel. He had a very different take on history, on progress, on the whole game.
Hegel was all about the dialectic, this grand unfolding of history through conflict and resolution.
So not just random events, but a purposeful movement.
Exactly. History's not just chaos for Hegel, it's a process.
A process towards what?
Towards the realization of reason. And for him, the state, the nation state, that was the culmination of this historical process.
Embodiment of a people's collective will, their identity.
A stark contrast to Kant's focus on the individual, right?
Yeah, big time.
Hegel was fascinated by those unique characteristics of nations, their cultures, their histories.
How those things shape their interests and actions on the world stage.
And I think it's safe to say this difference in perspective leads to some pretty different conclusions about war.
Oh yeah, Kant versus Hegel on war. That's a heavyweight bout.
And that's where we'll pick up after a quick break.
Stay with us.
All right, so we left off with this clash of titans. Kant saying war is a failure of reason. Hegel's saying it's kind of baked into the system.
Yeah, inevitable due to clashing national spirits and all that.
Right. And that's where things get really interesting because we can see how these ideas play out in the real world.
Especially in the world of international relations.
Exactly. And this is where it gets super relevant for UPSC folks.
Okay, so let's bring it down to earth a bit. How do these theories actually translate to the world we live in? Where can we see Kant's influence, for example?
Well, look at the whole system of international law and institutions that have sprung up since World War II.
The UN, the International Court of Justice, all that.
Right, the Geneva Conventions, too. All of these are attempts to create a more just and peaceful world order.
Based on shared principles, dialogue, a framework of rules.
Exactly. Very Kantian in their goals.
So are you saying these are like real-world attempts to put Kant's ideas into action?
I think you could definitely make that argument. The whole idea is to foster cooperation, prevent conflict, uphold human rights.
All very Kantian.
But of course, the reality is a lot messier than the theory.
Because, let's face it, the UN isn't exactly a perfect embodiment of Kantian ideals.
Not quite. Kant imagines states acting like these perfectly rational moral agents, always choosing the path of peace and cooperation.
Yeah, in the real world, states have their own interests, their own histories.
Their own baggage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're all vying for power and influence.
And that's where Hegel comes in.
Okay, I'm starting to see the Hegelian side of things here.
Hmm.
How would he view these attempts to create a Kantian world order?
Hegel, ever the cynic, would probably point to the inherent limitations of trying to impose a universal system of values on a world of diverse and often conflicting national interests.
He might even say it's doomed to fail.
He might even argue that this push for a Kantian utopia could actually lead to more friction, more conflict.
So instead of promoting harmony, it could backfire.
Exactly. Remember, for Hegel, conflict is the engine of history. It's through those clashes that new ideas and new systems emerge.
So trying to suppress those clashes is like trying to hold back the tide.
Exactly. And speaking of clashes, what about the role of nationalism? We're seeing a resurgence of it in many parts of the world.
Yeah, it's everywhere these days.
How do you think our philosophical heavyweights would interpret that?
Well, for Kant nationalism especially, the kind that leads to exclusion and aggression would be a failure of reason, a retreat from those universal principles he championed.
A step backward from the ideal of a global community.
All right. But Hegel, I bet he'd have a field day with this.
Hegel would likely see it as a natural, even inevitable assertion of those unique national spirits we talked about.
Remember, for him, history is driven by the clash of these particular identities.
He might even argue that the push for global integration and homogenization is what's fueling the nationalist backlash.
It's like a pendulum, swinging back and forth between these two poles. The Kantian urge towards unity and the Hegelian reality of difference and conflict.
That's a great way to put it. And for anyone studying international relations, this is crucial stuff.
Right.
These are the fundamental tensions that underlie so many of the issues you'll be analyzing.
Global governance, conflict resolution, the role of international law. It's all connected.
And that's why understanding Kant and Hegel is so valuable for the UPSC exam.
Because it's not just about memorizing facts.
Yeah.
It's about developing that deeper understanding of why things happen the way they do in international relations.
Exactly. And that kind of thinking is what's going to set you apart in the exam.
So we've got these two philosophical lenses, Kant and Hegel, and we can use them to look at the world and make sense of it all.
And that's what we're going to do in part 3 of this deep dive, where we'll look at some specific examples of how these Kantian and Hegelian ideas play out in the real world. Stay tuned.
Okay.
Okay, so let's put all this Kantian and Hegelian brainpower to work and see how it helps us understand what's happening in the world today.
Right, because it's one thing to talk about pure reason and the dialectic, but how do we actually apply these ideas to real-world issues?
Especially if you're prepping for the UPSC exam.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You need to be able to take these insights and turn them into exam gold.
So let's think about it like this. Every time you read an article about current events, every time you encounter a complex international issue, ask yourself,
What would Kant say? What would Hegel say?
exactly, put on those philosophical lenses.
So let's take an example. Let's say we're looking at the rise of China, the shifting balance of power, the potential for conflict.
How would our two philosophical heavyweights view this situation?
Okay, so from a Kantian perspective.
A Kantian would likely argue that the key to stability lies in integrating China into the existing international order, encouraging cooperation, promoting dialogue, strengthening international institutions.
Finding common ground. Building a rules-based system where everyone benefits.
Exactly. Very Kantian.
Okay, so that's Kant. What about Hegel? What would he say?
Hegel, being Hegel, would probably take a more cynical view.
He'd see the power dynamics at play.
The clash of civilizations, the struggle for dominance.
He might even say that conflict is inevitable.
A necessary step in the evolution of the international system.
Wow. Okay, so we've got these two very different interpretations, two very different sets of potential solutions.
And that's the thing. There's no easy answer.
No one right way to look at it.
And the UPSC examiners don't expect you to have all the answers. What they're looking for is your ability to engage with these complex ideas, to analyze the situation from multiple perspectives, and to formulate your own well-reasoned arguments.
So it's not about choosing sides, Team Kant versus Team Hegel.
Right. It's about using these philosophical tools to dissect the issue, to see it from every angle.
To understand the underlying forces at play.
And remember, context is everything. Both Kant and Hegel were products of their time grappling with the specific challenges of their era.
So we can't just blindly apply their ideas to the 21st century.
We need to consider the historical context, the specific factors at play today.
Right. So much to think about.
And that's the whole point of this deep dive, to get you thinking critically, to equip you with the tools you need to not only ace your exams, but to make sense of the world around you.
Because ultimately, this isn't just about passing an exam. It's about becoming a more informed, more insightful, more engaged citizen.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So to all you future diplomats out there, keep those brains buzzing, keep diving deep, and keep questioning everything.
And hey, if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to subscribe and like our podcast for more insightful explorations of the ideas that shape our world. We'll be back soon with another episode ready to challenge your assumptions and expand your understanding of international relations. Until then, happy studying.